Okay, I'm about to attempt something very difficult. I'm going to try and tell you what I'm going to do, and then I'm going to try and do it. And so I've been in the process of reading a book called Tom Cheetham. Well, an author, Tom Cheetham, The World Turned Inside Out is the name of his book. Henry Corbin and the Angel Out Ahead. And so what I was in chapter six, called Ta'wil and Prophetic Philosophy. And at the end, meaning at the final few pages, I encountered material that I felt to be so important that I wanted to record it separately and put it here. So now I'm going to try and explain why I feel that that's important. It has to do with reimagining our relationship with time and space in the context of a sort of active response to metacrisis and meaning crisis. And I have to try and construct a bit before I get to the content that I want to talk about. And it's going to be quite difficult. And I'm asking for, what am I asking for? I don't know, charity, poetic license. Gosh, I mean, let's see if I can construct in a way which seems reasonable to people. So a couple of resources that I would mention, from 2021, the video Making Sense of Sensemaking with Jordan Hall, Daniel Schmachtenberger, and Jamie Wheal, involved as sort of an orientation to not only collective intelligence, but a deeper, not just collective intelligence, but a collective awareness. The idea that we can be more aware. First of all, that's already a lot, right? And then the idea that group practice could give rise to that, and that navigating a way through the situation of the world now could be sort of afforded or helped by that. So that video, Making Sense of Sense Making, was significant to me because it showed and revealed, it pointed to this deep connection between sort of active real world response to metacrisis and meaning crisis, and on the other hand, group process, particularly the group process of awareness, to put it like that. Okay, so that's fine. And then I would also mention psychological drivers of the metacrisis. Yeah, that's from 2023, and it's Iain Mcgilchrist, John Vervaeke, and Daniel Schmachtenberger. And that's where, well, not only do we, lay out part of Vervaeke's prescription for the, again, ecology of practices in communities of practitioners with a viable worldview, with like dialogical, imaginal, mindful, and embodied practices. That's like great. That's the cultural response. Um, then we have also the idea that we can sort of exact from past religions, from past responses toward, let's say, greater consciousness, to just put it very simply and bluntly, that can help us to, again, navigate our way out of this situation that we have. On the one hand, the observation that we have all this extremely powerful technology that it's gonna, like, it's a self-termination scenario if we don't sort out our relationship with technology. Like one way of expressing that would be, hey, we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval technology, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. So we need this sort of love and wisdom to bind that technology. Again, this is through Daniel. And so there's a call there for a kind of, again, cultural awakening process, a process like some kind of cultural renaissance, cultural enlightenment, so that we can, work better with the tools that we have. The idea being that there needs to be different components of that involve genuine innovation. Like we need something new. The reason being that the technology that we have is fundamentally new. We have now the power to sort of all blow ourselves off the planet in many different ways, circa X risk landscape that we didn't have before, and that the novelty of that situation entails, the need for a novel kind of response. That's one. But on the other hand, we can also exact and draw from, and in a way, not in a trivial way, in a deep way, from the kinds of responses to the world situation, the human situation, that have come previously, such as religious responses that we can recognize, per Vervaeke, did genuinely do a lot of good in the world. Okay, that's all fine. And so that leads me to a certain framing, which is like, regardless of let's say that it's not about the sort of meta crisis, let's just sort of leave that to the side. What if we could just talk about sort of the human condition And the idea that this sort of situation that we've been in for like millions of years, and that in a way it hasn't been recognized properly, or that there's maybe I could submit the idea that there are things that obviously that we haven't noticed about the human condition that could be noticed and could be deeply helpful in a way. I mean, it's not quite the right word, regardless of whether the metacrisis is. So I want to say that the solution to the metacrisis is a kind of secondary effect. And so what I'm trying to do there is by I'm trying to draw lines of care that people could care about something to do with the human condition that has to do with enlightenment, say, or like Gnostic escape or whatever that have nothing to do with the metacrisis, and that with this sort of convergence on what we're sort of aiming for. Okay, what other pieces do I need? So I sort of think that we've been sort of stuck in the human condition in a way, and we haven't recognized who we are, and that we're actually not who we think we are. And if there were a way of exploring that comports with what I was just talking about, then I find that interesting and meaningful. I also notice that, you know, there is a metacrisis and meaning crisis, and I consider it to be meaningful to care about that and to try to quote unquote do something about it. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. That is all sort of going together. And then I would want to say a couple more things. Well, I think through Heidegger and others, certainly the sort of Sufi traditions that Corbin has been pushing, we have the idea that our metaphysics, or what's understood to be our metaphysics, are these sort of deeply structural elements of our worldview, of our way of being in the world, our way of inhabiting the world. And that if we can notice that, and if we can bring them up into our awareness, be conscious of our relationships with those, in a way, constitutive elements of our being that we normally rely upon, that there are certain affordances, existential affordances, opportunities for transformation that are made available that were not made available before. Okay, so again, I suggest here, what I'm suggesting is that in order to get through the situation, circa 2025, we actually need to transform ourselves. And I think it's rational and reasonable to notice that and then to aim for that in an explicit way with intention. And I noticed that reimagining our relationship with these structural elements of our quote unquote worldview could be really important in facilitating that. Let's say as a facilitator, I'm attuned to that. And so what do I mean? Well, I want to talk about two things now. One of them is time and space. And so that piece of it, I'm going to do that piece second. Actually, the first piece is part of the relevance of that making sense of sense making is that we drew the idea there from Jordan Hall and from others, and it's not only him, the idea of a cultural awakening, the idea of an enlightenment process. And Vervaeke's talked explicitly about reverse engineering enlightenment. So I'm not pulling that out of nowhere. We also have Thich Nhat Hanh, the next Buddha will be a Sangha, a community. So what's the relevance of that? Well, I'm going to give the analogy that Jordan gave at that time. So if you heat some water and you stir sugar into that water, if you dissolve the sugar in the water, you can dissolve more sugar in that water when it's hot than if it were cold. And that's called a supersaturated solution. And when you create a supersaturated solution, if you then let the water with the sugar cool down again and then knock it, like hit it a little bit, then it can crystallize. It can, I don't know if that's called a state change or whatever, into solid form. And the analogy is that we need something like that, but in culture. And that really requires, I'm really asking us to imagine that that were the case. So when we say that we need a kind of a cultural response, a cultural awakening, a cultural enlightenment, when we can understand that it's rational to seek, let's say, collective transformation, well, what do we mean by that? And I want to offer some speculative thoughts about that, and let's see if it lands with anyone. Well, firstly, we have the idea, and it's not just an idea, there are traditions all over the world that it's possible to be more aware. I think secondly, there would have to be that there's a tie, there's a connection between our awareness and our morality, our choice of what is good to do, deriving from our sense of what is and also who we are. So then I would say something, again, it's speculative. So is it the idea being that over a very long period of sort of culture, let's say, in history, let's call it that, we've been in a way cut off from who we are. And so what would that imply? That would imply that the sense of who we are that we have is is true in a way, but that there could be a sense of who we are that is more true, that we would feel differently about who we are. And so there I would connect the idea of sort of awakening with sort of cultural, again, cultural response to metacrisis and meaning crisis involving self-transformation of our sense of who we are, with a sense of collective identity, although that shouldn't be understood as distinct from individual identity. I would talk about both individual and collective, right? And also amnesis. So I'm talking about the idea of remembering who we truly are. And that if we can imagine that that could be possible, that it could have, that if that were possible, that it might have some bearing on the situation that is at hand. Okay, then what I want to do is notice that there has been a call for not only collective awakening, but for a catalytic community. And that's been explicitly, again, there was Jordan Hall and Vervaeke. We're talking to, military guys where the idea is of a team of teams, right? So what we're talking about is that same crystallization process of the supersaturated solution, but in culture. So we're trying to unpack a bit of like, what would that mean? What would it mean to have that? And it would mean, I think, a kind of group process that could give rise to a form of self-realization that perhaps has never been known before, that could involve a deeper, in a sense, a more profound sense of awareness, a deep shift, a change in who we are, in our sense of who we are. And that could occur not only in sort of that community, but that could function as a kind of catalytic event, right? That could spread to everyone or be picked up, be learned very quickly. The idea being that is it possible to imagine that there are kinds of group process that could give rise to such phenomena? The idea being, yes, it is possible to imagine that. And then we could sort of try to explore some of that space of like of what is possible. And then there's a sort of I would make two other sort of small points, which is that if we can imagine for the moment that for a moment that the whole, in a way, does have a kind of awareness, whether it's a collective humanity or the all of life or all of being or whatever, and that in some way, if we can imagine that as that we're unconscious of that that's who we are in a way, and that it's in some way under threat, like the noticing of the situation acts as a kind of imperative that to me the importance of noticing that would the idea would be that there are quite powerful forces that are at work operating from and sort of through the collective that are not exactly attributable to the agency of individual egos. There's more going on than meets the eye. So there's something going on. But it's again, it's like I want to be like the guy with the sign, the end is nigh. That's not, yeah, anyway. The other point would be, just briefly, that the role of our agency, our free will, is actually crucially important. And we see that through many, many different traditions. And well, why might that be? Well, I don't know exactly, but I have a sense for it that there's a certain kind of feedback loop, a certain kind of process that could be either participated in or given rise to that involves, in a way, the increasing of awareness, more existence, and that we haven't worked out what that is yet, but that we could. So there's a way that I'm saying that both that there are these extremely powerful forces that are at play, but there's some kind of quite small shift that could, be like tipping a snowball down a hill kind of thing. So if I use another analogy to try and illustrate that, I mean, so imagine from the point of view of the caterpillar that's going to become the butterfly, right? Well, from the point of view of the caterpillar, maybe the caterpillar sort of notices, hey, there's not going to be any more leaf that I can eat. I'm going to run out of leaf. And what I'm imagining is that noticing might have a key role to play in whether or not the caterpillar is able to become the butterfly. So there's a sort of triggering or activating process that I'm imagining that I think might come out of group process. Okay, now I have to sort of shut up and go back to the text. So what am I talking about here? Why is it relevant to what I've been saying with Corbin? Well, as per the Sufi tradition and through others, we're understanding, or I'm understanding, that again, these sort of structural underlying features of our metaphysics have been holding us back in a way that we haven't noticed. And that by relating with time and space differently, deeper depths of transformation in the sense of who we are could be afforded or could become available. And now I have to get a little more specific and draw from the text in a couple of pages that I want to see. I would draw on one other kind of example before I do that, and that is I was publishing on the sort of the Apocryphal Acts of John and the revelation of the Christ event. And I talked about that as a sort of one way of understanding it as sort of as an ingression from a higher dimension. But the basic idea being that revelation exists. There is such a thing as revelation. And again, it's hard to know what that means, what that is, when it's not something that we sort of have experienced. The idea being that there are certain moments, there are certain phenomena that can happen that are deeply disclosing or revealing, revelatory. That such occasions are in a way beyond description, that may take specific forms, like for example, the form of that cross, and that have a certain result, or in a way, it's an outcome, although there are problems with talking about it like that. But what I'm talking about is that it's a kind of event, it's a kind of metaphysical event, and it involves a sort of process of becoming, well, several things. In a way, more conscious, in a way, more of a person, in a way, existing more deeply, in a way, more present. And so I guess what I'm tying there is I think the sort of qualities that we can sort of rationally and reasonably believe that we sort of desire and want, given the human condition and given the situation, circa 2025. I'm tying all of that to revelation itself. Okay. And then I'm going to start trying to draw on Corbin and Heidegger, perhaps Jung, we'll see, as well as Christianity and Sufi Islam, I think, through Corbin. So what I'm going to be exploring from here is a little bit of what could be the relevance of the process that Corbin is talking about, or what Corbin is talking about, and particularly what is the relevance of reimagining time. The idea being that we have not appreciated the relevance yet, or at least I haven't. So for Corbin, my way into this was through Vervaeke's prescription. Again, this cultural response involving dialogical, imaginal, mindful, and embodied practice. Well, what is the imaginal? Why is it relevant? Okay, well, sort of Corbin's idea is that, again, the imaginal involving um, work with the soul. It's a little bit hard to say what I mean by that here, but just to say that it involves work with the soul, it involves work involving imagination. There's been a lot of publication on this already that can bind back together subject and object, knower and known, abstract and sensory. So there's a way of sort of rehoming which imaginal practice can give rise to. And there were several claims that Corbin was putting forth about that we're deeply connected with, and sort of going along with what I was saying earlier, is that imaginal practice, including but not limited to developing the capacity to sort of re-inhabit these different cosmologies, could give rise, and indeed may be crucial to giving rise to theophany. So what Corbin is focused on, so this is another, I would say this is another way of talking about revelation in a way. Corbin is focused on the link between gnosis, imagination and the imaginal, and theophany. So his focus is on a deeply personal or interiorized connection, relationship with what is divine, such as a revealed God, God as revealed. And he, I believe, feels that imaginal practice is really central to the realization of that and the self-realization of that. And we see a couple of things from that point. One of them is that where we have sort of forgotten imaginal practice, well, then it would make sense if Corbin is correct, right? That we've been deeply cut off from, as in not doing the things that we could have been doing, such as imaginal practice, to engage Gnosis. And that if we did, Corbin has talked explicitly about, in a sense, self-realization, becoming more present, becoming more of a personhood, that personhood is conferred in that way. And so the idea that personhood is in some way granted, one can be more or less of a person, one can exist more or less, one can be more or less present. So theophany, revelation of a personal God via imaginal practice. Okay, so from there, again, what we're going to be talking about is the way that sort of our sense of time and space have been maybe holding us back in a fundamental way. And obviously, we don't want to fall into sort of the Western secular utopian eschatology, which I'm trying to avoid. I'm just exploring here. But I think so. What Corbin has been talking about is many different pairs of dualities that he feels are relevant. And so let me try to describe what he means by this theophany in the way that he put it, is that that imaginal practice, which I've understood to be sort of practicing being able to take up the perspective of the soul, to inhabit the quote unquote imaginal world, to conceive of things in an imaginal way, to confer personhood upon things in a way and relate to them in that way, and that this can be practiced, right? That this kind of direction, also through prophetic philosophy, and again, the whole ecology of practices, right? That this kind of direction, that this kind of way could give rise to the amnesis or the self-realizing of of let's say who we really are, or of a being. And so I think what I would take from there is that there are several different dualities that have been discussed, such as esoteric and exoteric, individual and collective, the sort of higher and lower aspects of the soul, or the divine double in the soul, to put it differently, or the divine and the human, or God and man, to put it that way, or the eternal and the temporal, or chronological. And so the idea that I have here is that this process that Corbin is suggesting, I would say, and pointing to, and not only Corbin, right, is a way of, in a sense, pointing to or revealing the relationship between those dualities in such a way, that that another way of conceiving of that relationship arises, and that relationship, I'll give the example of the relationship between the higher and lower aspects of the soul, that this process can give rise to the self-realization of the being that is that relation. And that and this is so hard to grasp, so hard to imagine that. I'm not saying that I know what that means. But the idea is that because of our fallenness, the idea that we've lost awareness, that we've lost a sense of who we are, that we've lost the intentional practice that Corbin is pointing to, that we've actually fragmented as a result of that. And that our very conceiving of things in terms of these dualities is a consequence of that. Okay, so that's fine. Now I'm going to go into the text. So, yeah, where to go from there? So what Corbin has been talking about is a sort of a restoration, or again, amnesis of our sense of the eternal. So it's a when we've been normally, again, so now we're going to start talking about time. So we've had this like understanding, a certain understanding of time that is historical in a certain way, historicity, the idea of that the past and present and future. So chronological time, linear time. And we've been sort of oriented to that. We've been sort of, that's our worldview, that's our way of conceiving of time and what time is. So Corbin has the idea that that understanding of time is actually a mode of being. It's actually a mode of being present. So it's something that we, in a way, it's not something which is quote unquote true of the world. It's something that in a way we are doing. It's something that we are imagining. And we're inhabiting that as a world, as a mode of being. Okay, and so Corbin's idea is that, again, I would say through intentional practice involving practice with the imaginal and other practices, that there can be a restoration in our relationship with the eternal, deified. And so this is kairos, right? And that goes along with everything that I was just describing about revelation and gnosis, right? The eternal sort of is in that category. It's a time which is timeless. You know, we clearly see, for example, a connection between mystical experience and timelessness in the mystical experience questionnaire from Johns Hopkins. The point is it possible to appreciate that our relationship with time has in some way been precluding or foreclosing certain kinds of awareness or certain modes of awareness? And that if we could change our relationship with time, not by pretending, but really in actuality, that our shift of who we are could be different, that our sense of who we are could be different. Okay, so in that context, Cheetham states, in his late work, Heidegger meditated too about the structure of time in terms of presence and absence. He came to understand that past and future are both absent, but in different ways. The former, the past refuses, while the latter, the future, withholds. Okay, so I have to pause there already. So a Heideggerian understanding of time. So the idea here, again, is that past and future are both present by being absent. They're not here. The past has already happened, and the future has not yet happened. Literally, when I go out of the screen, right, the future is over here. It's not there. And the past is over there. It's already gone. So in this way, it's conceived that when we ground our sense of presence in that which is coming, and also in that which has already happened, either in, I would say, eschatology, utopian eschatology, or in a way, science, as in with reference to this experiment that already happened, there's a way that that can result in nihilism. Because what's most real is that absence, conceived nihilistically. And so Heidegger's idea is not only that that conception and that nihilism exists within historicity, right? Past, present, future. But that the past and future can be related to, in a way, as characters, or I think what Corbin would say as angels, but as that past and future can be personified in some way. And so this is implicit in what he's saying. So there's a way that it's really hard for us to get this. But I guess I'm asking you to imagine, can we hold in our mind our entire relationship with the future? Can we regard for a moment the entirety of what we call the past? And it's actually really difficult for us to do that. I would say almost impossible, because it's not just an idea. It's not just an idea. That's the whole point. It's actually it's actually a way of being present, and it's constituting our awareness right now. And Heidegger's idea is that by trying to, in a phenomenological way, in a Heideggerian way, assess the character of the future and the past, that they can come into view, that they can be sort of aletheically unveiled, that they can be disclosed. And so that's why he's able to talk about the past as refusing, as in you can't, it's already happened. You're refused from the past. And the future withholds, not yet, you can't yet. So in this way, is it possible for us to conceive of past and future as having character, and therefore in relationship with past and future, you could say as angels or as an extension of parts work, that those relationships can themselves be managed? Okay, so that's already a lot. And now Cheetham states, in the context of Corbin's analysis, we can say that the spaces and times of presence deny the refusal of the past, as well as the withholding of the future. And so what I take him to mean is that from out of deeper presence, when we have this normative orientation toward presence, that our relationships with past and future can be, in a way, better managed. Cheetham states, here too lies the deepest meaning of the significatio passiva, which is a term through Luther, which I take to mean something like uh, the possibility of grace, right? Our sort of openness to God, to the experience of God. Sort of, it's a quality of receptivity. Cheetham states, by opening ourselves to the spaces of the soul, we make ourselves capable of God. Okay, so I have to pause here. So I have to try and make sense of what he means by spaces of the soul. Well, again, the idea from earlier is that the process of, yeah, intentional practice, including imaginal practice, another way of sort of languaging that is in terms of soul work. And it's not important to get attached to that language. The point that I'm trying to make right now is that we had the idea through Cheetham, and by extension Corbin, that from that point of view, from in a way, from a point of view which is more, in a sense, native to who we are, closer to the essence of who we are, you could say, that time and space appear very differently. And so when he's talking about the spaces of the soul, I take that what he means is that if we can practice, if it becomes available to us to take up the perspective of the soul, that our conception, the sense of time and space that we have is quite different. One way of languaging that would be that there's the ego in its time and space, which is this past, present, future linearity, historicity, and there's the soul's time and space, which is different. And the further idea is that if we can open ourselves to that sense, both the perspective of the soul through the work that I've been describing, that Corbin's been describing, that Vervaeke's been describing, that through that work, we not only gain this capacity to inhabit the quote unquote imaginal world, to live in the world in a different way, but we quote make ourselves capable of God. Well, that's the same thing, right? The implication being that we haven't yet been capable of God. All of these themes come together in a passage in which Corbin speaks of the histories related in the book, meaning the Quran. Corbin states, and let's see if I read the whole thing or not, and before I stop the comment. Corbin states, if the past were really what we believe it to be, that is, completed and closed, it would not be the grounds of such vehement discussions. All our acts of understanding are so many recommencements, reiterations of events still unconcluded. Each one of us, willy-nilly, is the initiator of events in the imaginal world. Whether they abort in its hell or bear fruit in its paradise. While we believe that we are looking at what is past and unchangeable, we are in fact consummating our own future. It follows that the whole of the underlying metaphysics is that of an unceasing recurrence of the creation, not a metaphysics of the ens and esse, essence and existence, but of the ester, of being in the imperative to be. But the event is put again in the imperative, only because it is itself the iterative form of being, by which it is raised to the reality of an event. Perhaps, then, we shall glimpse the full gravity of a spiritual event and of the spiritual sense of events perceived in the imaginal world, when at last consciousness rediscovers the giver of what is given. Okay, that was the quote, and now I'm going to try and unpack what it means, or in the context that I've laid it out, which is again going to be difficult. Okay, so first of all, Corbin is suggesting, he's claiming that we believe the past to be completed and closed, and that that's an illusion, that we're, in a way, that we're wrong to conceive of it that way, that it's not truthful, that the past is actually not like that in truth. And he's saying that when we understand the past that way, as completed and closed, then that's a sort of an axiom. It's a structural feature of our metaphysics, of our way of being in the world, that we could call axiom, but it's more existential than that. That when we have that, when we hold that, when we rely on that, then our acts of understanding that come after that point are, quote, reiterations of events still unconcluded. Reiterations of events still unconcluded. So there's a way that he's saying that when we conceive of the past in that way, then we're sort of doomed to repeat it, and that we reiterate events in a way that doesn't allow for their completion, their fulfillment. And his claim is that that is actually what's happening now from out of that understanding of the past. And hence he says that each one of us is the initiator of events in the imaginal world. And so there's a quality, again, that we're not realizing about ourselves, it seems to be the case, that we are in fact inhabiting the imaginal world already. And that one way of inhabiting that imaginal world is to relate with the past in the way that we were just describing. And from out of that way, we believe that what we're looking at is past and unchangeable. And that this is a consummation of our own future. So what he's saying is that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy when he's saying that there is a kind of relationship between the way we look at the past and the way we look at the future. And I would say the way that we look at the future and the way that we look at the past. If we understand it to be closed or foreclosed, meaning that's definitely going to happen and there's nothing we can do about that. That what I'm saying is not with that attitude, right? So when we conceive of the past as unchangeable, we consummate our own future. It becomes that. It's a kind of self-entrapment. We're entrapping ourselves without noticing that that's what we're doing within a particular sense of past and future. What does he say about that? I think he's saying that if we notice that, if we can be aware of that, then the whole of the underlying metaphysics, and this is sort of what he's suggesting, is in fact the truth, is in fact an unceasing recurrence of creation. That creation recurs. This is the eternal return, right? Creation as happening. And what he connects this with is that, in a way, he's sort of saying that this linearity, this historicity of past and future, in a way, that's equivalent to the essence and existence. And in a way, he's saying not either of those two, but the esto, which he talks about as being in the imperative, to be. It's a kind of sense, it's a kind of awareness that God's being, the being of God, comes with an imperative for us to be. That is in some way, in terms of time, focused on the present, to be present, right? Rather than to be in past and future. And he's saying about that, it's a kind of event that it can be, that we can understand being or presence as an event. And that it is imperative, again, to be. He said, the event is put, or put again in the imperative, only because it is raised, only because it itself is. It is itself the iterative form of being, the iterative form of being. So this is sort of being as becoming that. So I have to steer us out of this now, but it's like that there is an iterative quality. I mean, it reminds me of evolution, right? Because it's like this is the reproduction of life forms. It's like kind of like this, and 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 it keeps doing that. And we have our days as well. Well, kind of like this, and kind of like this, and kind of like this, and we have our lives as well. Well, kind of like this, and kind of like this, and like that, right? the iterative form of being. And so he's suggesting that. And so I like what I'm trying to connect there. What I'm trying to connect there is the imperative to be that one can in fact be more. And it's so hard to, I mean, I don't know what that means, right? But the idea is that we could in fact exist more than we do. That we could be in fact more people than we are. We could be greater persons. We could be more present. And that is connected with a certain understanding that is imaginal in nature, but he would call more true. So it's a different way of inhabiting the situation, quote unquote. It's a different way of being in past, present, and future. That it has to do with recovering amnesis of a vertical relationship to the eternal in the light of the present. As he says, perhaps then we shall glimpse the full gravity of a spiritual event and of the spiritual sense of events perceived in the imaginal world. When at last consciousness rediscovers the giver of what is given, giver deified. So look, the implication there is that we, as consciousness, let's say, could rediscover something that we've lost. Namely, could rediscover the deity. And that this metaphysic, this understanding of time, this orientation within time could be a key to that. And this is, I mean, I'm not reading this in, it's right here. It's like that could be akin to, quote, to glimpse the full gravity of a spiritual event, which I take to be akin to Gnosis in the truest sense of the word, of revelation, right? Cheetham continues, the past and the future are indeed contained within and defined by a present, again capitalized, the reality of which is a function of the experience of the intensity of being given as a passion of and by the angel. In a way, it's like if so, like I can't, it's not possible to explain this, but I'm trying to bring the context to this, to understand the significance of this and the meaning of this that I don't yet know. Again, we have the same idea that it is in fact the case, that it is in truth the case that we have been blind to, right? That past and future are not something in a way that we exist within, that we're stuck within, but that past and future are both contained here in the present, and that they're defined by that present, that we could come to notice that again. Further, the idea that that present that we are, that presence, let's say, quote, is sort of given reality, the reality of which is a function of the experience of the intensity of being. So again, to me, it's the same kind of idea, the idea that we can in fact be more present, that there is greater intensity of being which is available that has a direct bearing on our relationship with time. And then I would say the obvious implication of all the affordances that could come from out of that. Here, this is conceived, this metaphysic, or this, again, this sort of iterative form of being, the imperative to be. There's a kind of normativity which is implied, what we should do about that. Again, the idea that we could rediscover something that we haven't known before or not for a very long time. And again, the previous idea that our egos are involved in that we could actually do something about that. That involves eros, that involves passion, that involves, well, intensity. Although, again, those may not be the only ways or the only ingredients. And now it gets even trickier. There's only a couple of pages, but it is difficult. And that's why I tried to bring a lot of the context that I wanted to bring earlier. Cheetham says, and I repeat that sentence, which said, the past and the future are indeed contained within and defined by a present, the reality of which is a function of the experience of the intensity of being, given as a passion of and by the angel. And so, the event of the great resurrection, the parousia or arrival of the Paraclete, the Holy Ghost, the return of the Holy Ghost. And so the event of the great resurrection, the parousia of the Paraclete, the expectation of which is in common between Islam and Christianity, and which is symbolized for Shiism in the person of the hidden Imam of the present time, is not an event which may suddenly erupt one fine day. It's something that happens day after day in the consciousness of the Shiite faithful. Okay, so then we get more of a quote from Corbin. Right, and I'm going to go into that quote, but I have to already try and talk about what we mean here because there's a lot that's being drawn on. There are sort of several different strands that I would say are running in parallel or in convergence. This is, again, we had the idea that the past and future are contained within a present that we've been unconscious of, but could be present to through imaginal practice. That could result in a sense, or go along with an experience of a greater intensity of being, or more presence, more personhood. Another way of talking about which is revelation, I would say, or gnosis. I know that's an oversimplification, but just for the moment. Okay, so another some mythological, or yeah, it's mythic, or it's literally like religious ways of talking about that is as the event of the great resurrection. The idea being that in a way, this is another language for the same event. Is it possible to imagine that quote unquote great resurrection, how is that different from the amnesis or awakening of, let's quote unquote, a being or beings that we haven't realized that we are? So to me, that's the same. And another instance of it, the parousia of the Paraclete, which is again the sort of the expectation of the arrival or return of the Paraclete, or again the third person of the Trinity, which again through Jung and others, and not only Jung, the third person of the Trinity is the between. It's the Holy Spirit, that which is between the opposites, meaning between the dualities that we were talking about earlier, such as subject and object, abstract and sensory, knower and known, esoteric and exoteric. And again, my idea would be any of them, any of the dualities, which I won't. Well, fine, I could throw that in there. One becomes two, two becomes three, the third, the Paraclete. And from the third comes the one as the fourth. I'll just have to leave that as something to chew on, but it's like, to me, that Gnostic prophecy is talking about the same thing. And so in these traditions, such as Islam and Christianity, that it's just conceived of as an event. But I think the trap here would be that it's sort of, the trap is that it's an event that's coming, right, in the future, that could lead on the one hand to sort of, again, utopian eschatology or sitting on our laurels. And I'll try and give an example of what I mean by that. Well, I'm going to give the example of Harry Potter again, because I happen to like Harry Potter. Again, at the end of Prisoner of Azkaban, the third film, Harry's battling the Dementors with Sirius, and he's traveled in time, back in time, to try and save Sirius. And he's watching Sirius get attacked by the Dementors, by the forces of, you know, depression and death and destruction and death of the soul, actually. And he says, "Don't worry, my dad will come and save us, save himself, and save Sirius." And Hermione is like, "Harry, no one's coming, bro. There's no one coming to save you." And Harry's like, "No, don't worry. It's okay. He'll show up at the last minute." And she's like, "No one's coming, Harry." And he's like, "Oh." And then he realizes who he is. And in that realization, which there's no difference between that realization and him acting, you could say that the realization is drawn out of him. The situation draws him into place. And what he does is he steps into the place that he thought was left for his father, and he's able to, for the first time, cast the Patronus, which is able to save himself and save Sirius. Why am I talking? Why is that relevant? Because he had an expectation that someone else was coming, that there would be something that could happen in the future. And he came to realize that to be a mistake. As Corbin said, it's not an event which may suddenly erupt one fine day. It's something that happens day after day in the consciousness of the Shiite faithful. Okay, so then there's a couple of things right there. One of them is that another way of talking about this same quote unquote spiritual event in Shiism is it's symbolized in the person of the hidden imam. So it's a kind of there's a hidden imam or guide who is, yeah, a person and sort of is going to come to be revealed. And it's kind of the same in some way as the arrival or return of the Paraclete. Again, I know that's an oversimplification, but the point is that it's not properly understood as something that will happen, but properly understood instead as something that is already happening right now. And again, it's like it's easy to say that, but then what would that mean? What would that entail? What would that imply? Well, it would change our direction. It would change our orientation. And again, that's the same as the Apocryphal Acts of John and the revelation of the act of Christ. The idea that there was a video that I published, crucifixion is reality. The idea that instead of being oriented to sort of take our spaceships out to the edge of the universe that way, like through linear space and time, like come on, guys, it's such a literal way of taking it. The idea would be, can we reorient to what is right here? And the idea is that not waiting for the second coming, right? But that there is something that we could in fact do, or a way to reorient ourselves. I would say that includes, but is not limited to, intentional practice that focuses on disclosing more of what is already here, of what is already present. Corbin continues, quote, the advent to come of the Imam presupposes the metamorphosis of men's hearts. On the faith of his followers depends the progressive fulfillment of this parousia through their own active being. Again, there's so much packed in these little phrases by Corbin, right? But it's so important to get this. It's when he says advent to come is like the Heideggerian with hyphens, it's one thing, advent to come. and it's capitalized, meaning deified. Again, it's a sort of anticipated, in a way, spiritual event. But it's in a way it's both, and that's why I think it's so tricky. It's like it's it's anticipated as literally as an event to come in the future, but it's also something that's happening now. And again, as you said, it's not an event that may suddenly erupt one fine day. It's something that happens day after day. And so that event, again, it presupposes something. It presupposes that the metamorphosis of men's hearts, quote unquote. So again, the idea being that there's a way of disposing our own care, could put it that way, that can result in a transformation that includes us, but which goes beyond us. And here, this is conceived not only of a transformation or metamorphosis of the heart, but of faith, right? That there's a certain faith, and that upon that faith, something is dependent. Well, what is dependent? Well, the progressive fulfillment of this parousia, this arrival, this return. So again, we had the imperative of being, the idea of to be, that it's possible to be more. Okay, well, imagine that the possibility for that, the progressive fulfillment of that, the actualization of that, is dependent on a quality of faith, faithfulness, that I would say derives from the proper recognition, the sense that that is in fact possible, that that faith in a way can be rational. Quote, on the faith of his followers depends the progressive fulfillment of this parousia through their own active being. So it's not just about faith. It's the way that we exist. It is our own active being that is expressive of that faith, let's say. The idea being that, again, it's so tricky because in a way it's something that we're already doing, but there's also a way that what we're doing already is a reiteration of events that are still unconcluded. So it implies that there's something more that we could be doing, that we could have more faith. Anyway, Corbin continues. The parousia of the awaited imam, again, the return, the arrival, the revealing, the appearance of the parousia of the awaited imam, signifies, quote, a plenary anthropological revelation unfolding within the man who lives in spirit, the man who lives in the spirit. So plenary meaning unqualified or absolute. So absolute anthropological revelation. Or plenary also means of a meeting to be attended by all participants, to be attended by all participants at a conference or assembly who otherwise meet in smaller groups. So, I mean, so do I have to draw out why that's so deeply connected or resonant with the context that I was bringing in? Right? So again, the parousia, the arrival of the awaited imam, signifies a plenary, which I would take to mean collective, in a sense, and absolute, also, anthropological revelation unfolding within the man who lives in the spirit. Well, who is that man who lives in the spirit? Well, there's a couple of possibilities. One is this, that it's just who we are, right? That's a pretty simple way of putting it. Another one is that revelation can sort of be understood as something that happens to us. But I think it can also be understood that if it can be understood, if we can grasp that revelation can actually change our sense of who we are, then imagine that we could get a sense that we are. I'll just use an example of the collective. Imagine that humanity I mean, it's just an example. I'm just imagining, right? Imagine that humanity is a being, right? And we haven't noticed that we are that. Well, imagine that through this process that could be remembered, that we could recall that that's who we are. Well, one way of conceiving of that is that within that man, that being, let's say, who lives in the spirit, revelation occurs. So within that man, revelation unfolds. And that revelation is the same revelation that in a way happens to us. Corbin continues. The Imam has said, quote, I am with my friends wherever they seek me, on the mountain, in the plain, and in the desert. The man to whom I have revealed my essence, that is to say, the mystical knowledge of myself, has no further need of my physical proximity. And this is the great resurrection. That's I'll probably leave that as it is because it's beautiful. But I would sort of simply say that it's pointing to the same thing. There's a way that what's already happening is that the man to whom I've revealed my essence, that is to say, the mystical knowledge of myself, has no further need of my physical proximity. And this is the great resurrection. So something about the significance of a certain absence where there is no physical proximity, that in itself could imply the presence of mystical knowledge. Again, where two or more gather in my name, there I am among them. And this is the great resurrection. Cheetham continues. These events annihilate continuous quantitative time in a way completely analogous to the shattering of language by the divine word as it flowed into the Quran. Okay, again, I would sort of suggest that a huge part of sort of, let's say, what's going wrong is our relationship with and inhabiting of continuous quantitative time. Here, this would be the understanding that if that understanding could be completely annihilated, that could be a good thing. That it's again an absolute, unqualified revelation that could deeply change our orientation, our sense of what's possible, what's valuable, what's important. It's also the same as in that movie Arrival, if you remember in that movie. Like at the end of the movie, it's the same, the time travel stuff. She's able to call up this, the equivalent of Xi Jinping, and say something that was like a secret that got him to stop and completely reorient to what was important. It's the same kind of idea. Okay, again, there's an analogy between the way that this kind of event could deeply change our relationship with time and the way that the divine word changes our relationship with language by shattering normal language as it flowed into the Quran. Corbin states, on each occasion, what occurs is a reassumption by the soul, a decision, a reconquest. These unities of discontinuous time erupt into our own time and confer the dimension of eternity upon the scissions they produce. these unities of discontinuous time erupt into our own time and confer the dimension of eternity upon the scissions they produce. It is through this rupturing of time that the truth of all history can finally shine forth. For through it, history is liberated and transmuted into parable. Wow. So again, there's still a lot here, right? So what he's saying, look, is that there are, it's not, maybe we could step out of conceiving of it as sort of one event, right? Maybe that there are multiple of these spiritual events, and we can understand this through looking at the, mystical experience is well known now. I mean, since William James and long before that time, the varieties of religious experience, Gnosis. I mean, there's the whole list of the greatest people that have ever lived. I'll sort of just mention Christ and the Buddha and Lao Tzu and Muhammad and Zarathustra as sort of being pretty close to the top of the list, don't you think? I mean, many people sort of agree. And so there's an idea of different occasions of something that is a kind of spiritual event. And that on those occasions, there's a kind of reassumption of the soul, reassumption of the soul. There's two senses of that I have. One of them is that there's a way that, and on each of these occasions, that the soul in a way gains something or is restored in a certain way. But there's also a way that, imagine that we're sort of stuck within a shell. Like, oh, that's a great one. Imagine that we're a little bird, that we are a little bird stuck within its little eggshell, and that these events, these spiritual events, break in through the shell. Again, quote, these unities of discontinuous time erupt into our own time. And so there's a sense that, again, this is kind of like where the light shines in a way. And so they erupt into our own time. Again, quote, and they confer the dimension of eternity upon the scissions they produce. Well, what is a scission, first of all? The action or state of cutting or being cut. Yeah, I'm reminded of Bateson, schismogenesis, but I'll leave that there. So there's a way that when these spiritual events, they sort of blast holes in our reality in a way. And that's a kind of break or cut, which seems destructive. But those moments, they're also conferred with eternity. They're, again, I would call it like ingressions from a higher dimension is one way of talking about that. And look, I mean, whole religions are built on people being in relationship with these moments, quote unquote, because it's about being in relationship with eternity. Again, quote, it is through this rupturing of time, it's through this rupturing of time that the truth of all history can finally shine forth. For through it, history is liberated and transmuted into parable. So I would suggest at the end there that sort of there's a way that this rupturing of time can be understood in the way that we've been describing as something profoundly beneficial and helpful, useful, and moreover, something that can be sought out, something that can be intended. Aspired to. Again, I'm reminded just briefly of McKenna and the end of history, right? We can see that one way or another, the history of the silly monkey is over. We sort of have to do this. It's kind of like either we crash and burn, right? And it's, the human experiment comes to a completion, or we can do this process of waking ourselves up. I mean, maybe that's too much of a, maybe people don't like that simplification, but it's kind of like, I really don't see how we can sort of just continue because of all the, there's a lot, because of the situation that I won't bother to lay out here. Okay, so last page. Cheetham states, these revelations apply not to the soul alone. They apply to the world. This might also be difficult. Cheetham says, here again, in another context, we discover that, quote, magical faculty of the soul, born to its own, quote, perfect nature. We won't get too hung up on that. I would simply say that this is sort of, again, the idea of that this practice involves getting more familiar with the soul in some way. It involves imaginal practice that can include taking up the perspective of the soul, developing a relationship with it, and from out of it with the quote unquote divine double or sacred second self or Socratic daimonion. And that's a little too complicated, though. It's taking us too far afield. So just to say that the implication is that through this kind of practice, that there is quote faculties that become available that were not available before, and that this has to do with the quote unquote perfection. Again, this sort of purification stuff about doing soul work. This essentially, I would understand that as another way of talking about Jungian individuation. But anyway, the idea of the magical faculty is somewhat original. I don't mean to be too critical. I'm just getting through to the end now, and it says, for Corbin, the incarnation, meaning of Christ, is not a mystery. It is the denial of mystery through the literalization of the sacred. Mystery requires the magical faculty, quote, of the image of the angel. Okay, so here the idea is that this magical faculty that's being discussed is again through imaginal practice. There can be a certain one of those inner dualities, those splits that we were talking about, was the relationship between quote unquote the lower or earthly aspect of the soul and the higher or celestial aspect of the soul, the latter of which is conceived to be the divine double or angel. And so the idea would be that through imaginal practice, the relationship between those two can be restored. And that another way of talking about that is as the amnesis or self-realization of the being that they are, which they are fragments of. And again, that the imagination, work with the soul, the imaginal are all deeply involved in that process, which is essentially, I would call it, in a way, another way of talking about the same thing, although it's being given a flavor of interiority and individuality here. Mystery requires the magical faculty of the image of the angel. The awaited Imam as the Paraclete, the Holy Ghost, quote, enables all things to speak. Enables all things to speak. And in becoming alive, each thing becomes a threshold of the spiritual world. So to me, this would go along with the work having to do with re-ensoulment. It's being in the imaginal world. So that's what this is another way of talking about. From the third comes the one as the fourth. From the third, one becomes two, two becomes three, and from the third comes the one as the fourth. So it's a way of, I would call, giving voice to nature, giving voice to things, allowing them to speak, right? Conferring language upon things. And I would also, that's to me, that's exactly the same as the process of the discovery of language for the first time. It's an equivalent. The awaited Imam as the Paraclete, the Holy Ghost, enables all things to speak. And in becoming alive, each thing becomes a threshold of the spiritual world. And this finally is the plenary meaning, the absolute unqualified meaning of the hermeneutics of the word become flesh. All things speak. Only through the word can the cosmos be released from the world of literal matter, quantitative space, and historical time. Without this presence, the world is mute, faceless, collapsing forever downward to the level of object. With it, not just the human soul, but the world itself exists in a perpetual state of resurrection. In this spiritual alchemy, we may find the antidote to agnosticism and nihilism. So we now get a short quote from Corbin and then the final paragraph. I just wanted to suggest there that at the end, what I'm going to do is quote something else. Just briefly, we saw how the role of the word, and again, the word become flesh, is central. There's a way that again, the Paraclete or the Holy Spirit, who by the way is sort of understood to be the I don't know, the hero or the sort of saving figure of the third Christian millennium. The idea that it was Christ for the last aeon, and now for the next aeon, it's the third, it's the Holy Ghost, it's the between. And that anyway, that's just another way of talking about it. So the idea is that this, again, that Corbin's describing a certain way, a way involving imaginal practice, and a way that involves, again, this sort of spiritual revelation that we've been talking about, involving that can be languaged as the awaited Imam or as the Paraclete or as the Holy Ghost, and it enables all things to speak. And in becoming alive, each thing becomes a threshold of the spiritual world. So it has a quality of conferring aliveness, conferring the capacity to speak. That's the plenary meaning of the hermeneutics of the word made flesh, that all things can speak. And so it's sort of through the word. And now I want to understand this as the ingression from a higher dimension that we took well, at least that I took the Apocryphal Acts of John revelation of the Christ event to be. Again, I'm actually gonna read the quote from the Apocryphal Acts of John, which starts with a quote from Christ, who says, John, for the multitude below in Jerusalem I am being crucified and pierced with lances and staves, and vinegar and gall are given me to drink. But to you I speak, and what I say hear. I put it into your mind to go up on this mountain. I put it into your mind to go up on this mountain, that you might hear those things which a disciple must learn from his master, and a man from his God. And now John states, and with these words he showed me a cross of light, and about the cross a great multitude that had no form. And in the cross there was one form and one appearance. And above the cross I saw the Lord himself, and he had no outward shape, but only a voice, and a voice not such as we know, but one sweet and kind, and truly that of a God, which spoke to me, quote, John, one man must hear this from me, for I require one that shall hear. For your sakes, this cross of light, for your sakes, this cross of light was named by me now Logos, now Nous, now Jesus, now Christ, now door, now way, now bread, now seed, now resurrection, now Son, now Father, now pneuma, now life, now truth, now faith, now grace. So it is called for men, but in itself and in its essence is spoken of to you. It is the boundary of all things, and the composing of things unstable, and the harmony of wisdom and the wisdom that is in harmony. Quote, for there are places of the right and of the left, powers, authorities, archons, daemons, workings, threatenings, wraths, devils, Satan, and the nether root whence proceeded the nature of whatever comes to be. And so it is this cross, and so it is this cross which joined all things together through the Word. And so it is this cross which joined all things together through the Word, and which separated the things that are from those that are below, and which caused all things to flow forth from the one. But this is not the cross of wood, which you'll see when you go down from here. Neither am I he that is on the cross, whom now you do not see, but only hear his voice. I passed for that which I am not, for I am not what I was to many others. For I am not what I was to many others. But what they will say of me is vile and not worthy of me. Since, then, the place of rest is neither seen nor named, how much less will they see and name me, their Lord? Now the formless multitude about the cross is of the lower nature. And if those whom you see in the cross have not one form, then not all the parts of him who descended have yet been recollected. But when the nature of man has been taken up, when the nature of man has been taken up, and a generation of men that obey my voice draws near to me, he that now hears me shall be united with them, and shall no longer be what he now is, but shall stand above them, as I do now. For so long as you call not yourself mine, I am not what I was. For so long as you call not yourself mine, I am not what I was. But if you understand me, you shall be in your understanding as I am. And I shall be what I was when I have you with me. And I shall be what I was when I have you with me. For this you are through me. Behold, what you are, I have shown you. Behold, what you are, I have shown you. But what I am, I alone know, and no man else. Therefore, let me have what is mine, but behold what is thine through me. And behold me truly, not as I have said I am, but as you. And behold me truly, not as I have said I am, but as you. Being akin to me, know me. And behold me truly, not as I have said I am, but as you, being akin to me, know me. And behold me truly, not as I have said I am, but as you, being akin to me, know me. Well, that was from the Apocryphal Acts of John, describing John's vision of Revelation. And it was reprinted in Murray Stein's Jung on Christianity, in Jung's essay on the mass and the individuation process, originally published in Psychology and Religion, which I already recorded four videos on. And what was that in connection to? Well, it was in connection to spiritual alchemy and what was being said here about the importance of the word and all things speaking. I guess the idea is that this is something, I mean, look, that's what he said, right? I mean, it's just, I don't know how I can add anything. It's not, yeah. If anyone gets through this, like, what have please comment or like let me know what have I not said that I need to say. Um, because I think all that remains with this sort of thing is to actually do it. I think it's something that can be done. And I've been sort of talking around it and pointing to it. And it's sort of something that I can get the sense for, but I don't know, like it's maybe requires groups. But sometimes like there might be something that's sort of obvious to me that like if people have questions at this point, I need to know what they are. But if anyone got through this, like that's amazing. So, but look, let me just finish off. I mean, it's hard to follow what Christ said, but I'll finish off with what Cheetham and Corbin have to say, which is half a page. Again, Cheetham was saying, and this finally is the plenary meaning of the hermeneutics of the word become flesh. All things speak. Only through the word can the cosmos be released from the world of literal matter, quantitative space, and historical time. Without this presence, the world is mute, faceless, collapsing forever downward to the level of object. And I would say annihilation. With it, not just the human soul, but the world itself exists in a perpetual state of resurrection. In this spiritual alchemy, we may find the antidote to agnosticism and nihilism. So I'm going to read that short quote. I just emphasize what I would emphasize here is that this is sort of, again, it's a process, a kind of alchemical process that can be participated in, that involves a key role given to language. The idea being that we haven't been doing that already. But it's tricky because it's also something that we're already doing. And it's about noticing that more. Difficult. Corbin says, if one of the destructive aspects of nihilism appears to us in the disenchantment of a world reduced to utilitarian positivism, without finality in the next world, we catch a glimpse, perhaps, of where to raise the ramparts against this nihilism. I'll leave that there. That doesn't necessarily add anything. There are questions about what the proper role of nihilism is in all this. Is it just as incentive? Where to fit nihilism? What place does it have? How does it fit into place? Cheetham continues. We can now understand the saying of the sixth Imam. Alchemy is the sister of prophecy, both capitalized. Alchemy is the sister of prophecy. A prophetic philosophy properly includes a theosophy of nature, also capitalized. A prophetic philosophy properly includes a theosophy of nature, which is consummated in alchemy. And the alchemical work fulfills the requirements of cosmic salvation. Alchemy expresses the ultimate meaning of the world as symbol. Alchemy expresses the ultimate meaning of the world as symbol, and a phenomenological hermeneutics properly has as its task the transmutation of the world by means of unveiling the word in all things. Alchemy expresses the ultimate meaning of the world as symbol, and a phenomenological hermeneutics, which is, I would say, that the Heideggerian stuff, prophetic philosophy, properly has its task as the transmutation of the world by means of unveiling the word in all things. It is to the question of a prophetic philosophy or theosophy of nature that we now turn. So there's a final footnote, which is that it's the contributions that he made to the understanding of alchemy that Corbin finds the greatest importance of Jung. So, which is to say that Jung's greatest contribution, according to Corbin, was in his alchemical writings, quote, particularly with reference to the doctrines of the subtle body, which is quite interesting. But so, look, so what's tied there is so revelation, self-realization, alchemy, prophecy, prophetic philosophy, a theosophy of nature. We were also talking about theophany earlier, which is sort of, again, the sort of revelation of a personal God. And sort of the word become flesh, a perpetual state of resurrection, an antidote to nihilism. Again, obviously, imaginal practice, the unveiling of the word in all things. We also had the sort of the completion of, I mean, it's the fulfillment of what Christ was saying, as far as I could tell. The idea that it's sort of, again, something to be participated in, something to be done, a process to get in motion that we haven't been doing. Right? And that's kind of why things are going wrong in a way, to put it that way. And again, I would just say at the end, this is just another way of languaging what I've said here, if I make that a little more visible. Again, I mean, at the end, it's like, it's a depiction of an experience, and one becomes two, two becomes three, and from the third comes the one as the fourth. I understand that is it's a Gnostic prophecy. It's a Gnostic alchemical prophecy that has been, since Maria Prophetessa in the first century AD, I think. And that's another way of talking about, just to say that what I mean is that I sort of, that quote sort of opened up as a koan on a particular time for me, and it sort of opened up over the course of the day and then closed down again. And I have a sense of what is meant here, because it's not just like words, right? But I don't quite know how to, I mean, so where am I going wrong in this? Like, let me know where I'm looking at it in the wrong way. What am I missing? Because like to me, this is like a manifesto, I mean, it's like, I mean, it's not, I mean, I'm kind of teasing, but it's like, I could just add at the end that the whole, I mean, for example, Jung's understanding of the whole point of alchemy is that there's a sort of conscious and unconscious, and it's a sort of compensating process, and the way that sort of spirit was incarnated in Christ, and the fulfillment of the alchemical sort of dream, whatever, is sort of compensating incarnation. That there's something that could sort of come up from the world of the mother, from nature, into an incarnation, um, that in a way compensates and fulfills the Christ event. From the third comes the one as the fourth. I don't know how else to language that, but just to say that I kind of get what's meant by that in this context. The fourth is nature, if that wasn't clear. And I have to just sort of leave it at that. I mean, I can't think of what else to say. I mean, it seems this is as concise as I can make it, right? And it's like it's a lot. I mean, to me, the probably the most significant part is like, I mean, it's all like great ideas, but then okay, what do we actually do? Well, we have that as well. There's a lot of things to do here through all of this. And then I think one of the most important parts was imaginally reimagining our relationship with time and space, particularly past and future. And sort of, yeah, regaining the mythic sense of participation in eternity through intentional practice, because that, to me, makes a whole lot sort of leverageable that wasn't leverageable before. And that was when I started to understand that that was what was being suggested. That was when I was sort of like, oh, wow, that's really quite relevant. No eschatology, no utopia. I've been clear about that. Okay, I'll leave it at that because what else can be said, you know? Enough, enough.